The devil loves to preach about suffering. He loves to tell us through his servants that as Christians, we should never suffer. He loves to teach us that if we are followers of Jesus, then suffering is not our portion. But remember in Matthew 16 when Jesus said that he himself was going to suffer and die? And Peter takes him aside and he rebukes him and he says, "No, Lord, you're a king's kid. This can never happen to someone like you." And Jesus says to him, "Get behind me, Satan. Your thoughts on my suffering are not the thoughts of God. It's the preaching of the devil." But fast forward to 1 Peter, and he's preaching a much different message. We saw in last week's reading where he said that we actually should expect that we'll have to patiently endure suffering as his followers for the sake of the gospel. In fact, he says in chapter 2, verse 21, that you have been called for this very purpose, since Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He's saying that as Christ suffered so that we could have life in him, we ourselves are called to endure suffering with an unshakable hope and with a Christ-like love that points other people to find life in him as well. Therefore, he begins in today's reading in chapter 4, since Christ suffered in order to give you life, live your lives in the same way and for the same purpose. He says that life is too short to waste it the way that the world lives their life, just doing whatever they can to try to satisfy their own selfish desires. He says as followers of Jesus, we should live lives with a very intentional focus, to love God with all of our hearts and to love others for the sake of the gospel and for the name of Christ. Beginning in verse 7, he says, live a life of prayer. Live lives filled with Christ-like love and with hospitality. In verses 10 and 11, he says, use the gifts that God has given you to the fullest for the good of others and for the glory of God. And then when suffering comes, Peter gives us wise counsel on how we ought to view that suffering as children of God from God's perspective. First of all, he says in verse 12, don't be surprised by it. This is not something unusual. He's already told us that suffering is expected as followers of Jesus seek to walk with him and share the gospel in the world. Number 2, he says in verse 13, not only should we not be surprised by it, but that we should rejoice in it. He says that that is proof that the Spirit of God is at work in us. You see, we have an enemy, and if we're walking closely with Jesus, he will try to either stop us in our tracks or to lead us down a different path. Someone once said, if the devil's not fighting against you, it might be because he's walking beside you. J.C. Ryle says, the very fact that he assaults us ought to cause us to rejoice with hope. So we shouldn't be surprised by our suffering. We should rejoice in our suffering. And number 3, he says we should remember that he is God and that we should surrender ourselves fully to him. Verse 6, he says, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. This is so important because when things get tough, the enemy will try to consume us with fear. He'll try to make us think that God doesn't love us anymore. He'll try to isolate us and make us feel like we're all alone in our pain. So verse 7, cast all of your anxieties on the Lord. Because even though we don't understand what he's doing, we know that he cares for us. We can trust his heart. So we give ourselves fully to the Lord. And then he says, number 4, we resist the devil. Be very aware, he says, that in the midst of your pain, the enemy will try to use it to lead you astray. So resist him. How do we do that? He says, stand firm in your faith. In other words, cling to the certainty of your hope in Christ. Remember who you are in him and look ahead to the promise of your eternal inheritance that he has reserved for you. And know that you're not alone. You are actually part of a global fellowship of brothers and sisters who are suffering for the sake of the gospel. And finally, number 5, remember that God's in control. Those authorities who oppose you and persecute you are not in charge. The devil is not in charge. The one who is in charge is the one who you call Father, the one who loves you, the one who gave his life for you. He holds our lives in his hands, and he promises that he will not fail to use every painful moment to do something glorious in us. Peter ends his letter with this, verse 10, after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you into his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. to Him be all the dominion forever and ever.